So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Irene Loni from the Faculty of Business and Law here at University of Wollongong. I research pro-social behaviors like volunteering and like body tissue donations. It's a pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here today. Thank you for joining us. The Luminaries series brings together leading UOW researchers, industry experts, and thought leaders for a 1-hour conversation every fortnight. Today, we will discuss how research and collaboration at the University of Wollongong is tackling global challenges. And today we welcome colleagues involved in stem cell donation and transplantation, including members from the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry, the ABMDR, and the TLR Foundation. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge country.
We acknowledge that country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships.
The University of Wollongong spreads across many interrelated Aboriginal countries that are bound by their sacred landscape, an intimate relationship with that landscape since creation.
From Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast. From freshwater to bitter water to salt. From city to urban to rural.
The University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that has kept alive the relationships between all living things.
The university acknowledges the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus's footprint.
And commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education.
Thank you. I would like to welcome our panelists for today. So I'll start with Ron Sluter, is a professor in cell and molecular biology in the School of Chemistry and Molecular Bioscience at the University of Wollongong. Ron's primary research interest is in communication pathways between immune cells and its roles in health and disease. We also have Ian Carriage with us, who is a hematologist and BMT physician at Royal North Shore Hospital and Professor of Bioethics and Medicine at the University of Sydney. Ian's research interests include health ethics and in hematology focus on the late effects of bone marrow transplantation, survivorship, and myeloma. We have Dr. Gemma Kirlin, an associate professor in nursing in a conjoint position with UOW and St. George Hospital, where her remit is to build research capacity within the nursing workforce at St. George. Gemma's primary research interest is in the area of cancer and stem cell transplant survivorship and long-term outcomes. Also, welcome to Kate Levy, the head of marketing and engagement at the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry, publicly known as Strength to Give. And last and definitely not least, welcome to Neil Pennick, the co-founder of the TLR Foundation, a small nonprofit dedicated to helping those being treated for blood cancers and other diseases treatable with stem cell transplant. We'd like to encourage members of the audience to submit their own questions using the Q&A function. We will try and get through as many questions as we can in this session. I would like to start with Gemma and Ian, who will give us a brief overview on stem cell transplantation, what's used for, how it's done, the risks associated with it, the kind of donors that are needed, donation landscape in Australia, and the problems that patients face after transplantation. So Gemma and Ian, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Irit. So as Irit mentioned, I'm Gemma and I'm a haematology and stem cell transplant nurse and researcher, and Ian is a haematologist and stem cell transplant doctor and professor of bioethics. We've worked together for a very long time, and I think it's fair to say I've taught him everything he knows. So we decided I'd talk today, and we're doing a whistle-stop tour of stem cell transplantation. So firstly, I just wanted to touch on the terms used to describe stem cell transplant. So for someone like me and maybe Ian, we more commonly know it as BMT, or still refer to it as BMT, and that was when it was called bone marrow transplant and blood and marrow transplant. But more recently, it became hematopoietic stem cell transplant, hematopoietic progenitor stem cell transplant, and you may also see cord blood. So that's just to say that when you hear or see these terms in the media or literature, they're different names, but they all mean the same thing, and they've just occurred naturally as science has progressed. But today we're referring to it as allogeneic stem cell transplant. The basics of this type of transplant is that it treats certain blood cancers, blood and immune disorders, so things like leukemia, lymphoma, myelodysplastic syndrome. There is a pre-treatment phase where we give patients high doses of chemotherapy plus or minus radiotherapy, and we wipe out their stem cells or their blood stem cells. And we take stem cells from a donor where we can take it from either the blood, the bone marrow, or the umbilical cord, and we give it back to the patient as an infusion. So it's a very small bag of sort of reddish covered fluid, and it's quite anticlimactic often for patients. Really important that the donor is HLA matched, which is about, so we look at the immune system and at the markers and make sure that they need to be quite similar. And donors can be either related or unrelated. In Australia, in the Australian context, transplantation is uncommon, but it's well established. So we do about 700 a year in Australia, and over a third of them are done in New South Wales. So we transplant the most people in this state. There were increasing indications for all transplant types. So we're finding more and more things to treat with transplant, but acute leukemia remains the most frequent thing. Advancements in conditioning and supportive care, so advancements in the chemotherapy and the anti-cancer drugs and the supportive care, things like nausea and vomiting, medications that protect the liver, blood product support, all those things, as they've improved, it's meant that we've been able to open up transplant to people who are older and sicker. So we transplant more and more people, and more people that have comorbidities. But the reason we do that, it's a good thing that we do that because survival is improving. So this is saving people's lives. The graph on the left, on my left, shows 1 year survival. So over the last 20 years, it's on average, it's improved by about 20%, and our 10-year survival also is improving. So if you are a child, or if you're less than 16 years of age when you have a transplant, depending on the disease that you have, there's between a 47 to 97% chance that you'll be alive 10 years later. If you are 16 or older when you have a transplant, again, depending on the disease, there is a 27 to 83% chance that you'll be alive long term. But, you know, this doesn't come without a lot of risks. There are things that we have to monitor, keep an eye on after transplant, and the things that people die from after transplant, the primary cause of death in that first year is relapse. So we haven't been able to treat the disease. So people, often the disease will just take over and we can't do anything about that. Then there are transplant related issues. So they're predominantly things like infection, graft versus host disease, which is what Ron will be talking about, or actually we'll all be talking about, but where Ron's research is. Then organ failure, so liver, kidney, lung, all those kind of things are impacted in that first year, or heavily impacted. Rejection and poor graft, so that's where the stem cells don't do what we wanted them to do, hemorrhage and cardiac toxicity. So it's a very toxic procedure, and lots of things that we need to get under control in that first year. the long-term and later effects, I guess this is my claim to fame and my reason for being on this panel. About 13 years ago, Ian and I started a big project that became my PhD, which was looking at the experience of long-term survival following allogeneic transplant, which you'll see there, I've called it BMT, where we knew from international data that there were a lot of long-term and late effects, but we didn't have any Australian data about what was happening or what had happened to our patients in Australia and what life was like after transplant. So we did a large study of New South Wales survivors and asked them what had happened, what kind of diseases had they, or chronic sort of late effects had happened to them, had they returned to work, had they had a family, what was their quality of life, all of that kind of thing, what kind of healthcare and screening did they have. And we used all of that to write guidelines and also use that data to help with advocacy for improving service provision. This list here is what we found out. So there is a lot of problems long-term after transplant that we see. I won't go through them, but it's just to say that there's a very sort of broad range. They impact every body system, but that graft versus host disease is the most deleterious. So if you have graft versus host disease, your risks of experiencing one or more of those other issues is about 5 times higher. So that's where I spend a lot of my time and do a lot of research in that area. But just returning back to the donor side of things and the research that we're talking about today, clearly transplant, this might sound very obvious, but it's only possible when people donate their stem cells. So family members, like I said, you can either be related or unrelated. Family members can donate to each other, but you've got a less than 1 in 4 chance to find a matched related donor. And worldwide, there are 42 million donors, and that sounds like a lot of people, but it's actually very difficult to find a suitable donor. And the global pool doesn't represent our global population. So there are inbuilt racial and ethnic inequities that happen. If you are a white patient, you have about an 80% chance of finding a donor. If you are from First Nations, that is down to about 15%. If you look at the graph on the right, that the blue color bars show us how many transplants we have performed where the donor has come from Australia, and the red bars show us how many transplants we have performed when the donor has come from another country. So we are completely reliant, well, not completely reliant, but we are very reliant on international donors. And that's a problem because getting stem cells is inherently expensive and complex. But if you add on top of that, that someone needs to leave Australia, go to the country, pick up the stem cells, and then not let those stem cells out of their site until they deliver them back into Australia, into the hospital where the patient is having the transplant, it just adds a number, another layer of complexity and moving parts. And it's obviously going to be very difficult during a global pandemic. There's also a point of no return for the patient. So once we've started the chemotherapy, we need, those stem cells need to be in the country and in the hospital, which, that would be if the patient was on, if the donor is onshore, that makes it a little bit more secure. So that is how I'm ending, is that in Australia, we need more donors and more donors who are better matched. So that's young men and men who are accessible, and they need to share the ethnic characteristics of the Australian population.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you for the overview on how blood stem cell donations work. And I'll go back to what you mentioned earlier about that problem of GVHD, or graft versus host disease. So Ron, your research has been looking at stem cell transplantation and this major negative outcome. You're looking at the causes and cures and prevention. So could you tell us a little bit more about your research?
Okay, thanks, Irit, and thank you for everyone for joining us this afternoon. So I assume people can see that. Yes, so continuing on from what Gemma was speaking on, and the reasons for donor blood stem cell transplantation. As Gemma said, it's a life-saving treatment for various disorders. Data that was published around 8 years ago said there's about 500 transplants each year in Australia and New Zealand, and about 20% of those occur in children. And as Gemma said, these occur mostly for people with blood cancers, acute myeloid leukemia, other forms of leukemia, lymphomas, myeloma, myelodysplasia, or MDS, as well as a growing increase for use in non-cancer treatments such as for bone marrow failure, anemias, thalassemia, and primary immunodeficiencies, especially in children. Donor blood stem cell transplantation requires a willing and committed donor. And that donor also needs to be the best possible match, as Gemma had spoken about. In addition, we have obviously the recipient who requires the blood stem cell transplantation. And so this person would normally, who's going to be the donor, would inject themselves with a growth hormone for 4 to 5 dailies. This then increases the amount of circulating stem cells in their bloodstream. Their blood can then be collected at the end of this injection period. And then those stem cells are collected. In some instances, they may be stored overnight or frozen if they need to be transported for long periods. And then from there, they're injected into the recipient, who has also been prepared prior to transplantation. And at this point, it's really important that both the donor and the recipient remain committed, because the recipient, depending on their various treatments, can be quite vulnerable at this stage. And so then following this, we have injection of the donor stem cells into the recipient. And just as a side note, these days, and most of the stem cells originate from the blood, but bone marrow can still be used, as well as other sources that Gemma mentioned. And in particular, in blood cancer patients, the idea of an allogeneic or donor blood stem cell transplantation is to prevent cancer relapse. So here we have a patient who has a cancer within themselves, and so this patient then undergoes a preconditioning regime, usually involving radiotherapy and chemotherapy, and the hope is that this will remove most of the blood cancer cells. Then we take the stem cells from our willing and matched donor. Those stem cells are then injected into the host, and the primary purpose of this in the first instance is to reconstitute the bone marrow and blood cells to help the person remain alive. But in addition, there's this unexpected, or was originally an unexpected, but now well appreciated effect called the graft versus leukemia effect, where the donor immune cells in the graft will attack any remaining blood cancer cells and hopefully eradicate them, leading to blood cancer-free survival in the recipient. So one of the points that we're trying to emphasize today, that survival in donor blood stem cell transplantation is proportional to the donor match quality. So in this complex table, which you don't need to study too detailed, on the left we have the 4 major types of donor transplantation, and as you go down the column, you see a decreasing match quality. And this decreasing match quality also parallels the decreasing survival rates. And so the better the match, the better the survival, and vice versa. And what contributes to this lack of survival? Well, first of all, it's cancer relapse, which can contribute to the person's premature death, but also other forms of non-relapse mortality, which Gemma also mentioned. And these can take the form of graft rejection, infection, and graft versus host disease. So graft versus host disease is an inflammatory disorder whereby immune cells in the graft will attack the recipient host tissues. So the graft or donor, recipient host, hence the term graft versus host disease. And these immune cells can then attack various organs, in particularly the lungs, the liver, the gut, the skin, and in some cases, the brain and eyes. And so what we've been doing for over a decade here is asking the question, can stem cell transplantation be improved by preventing GVHD without compromising transplant benefits such as the graft versus leukemia effect? And so to do this, we use a humanized mouse model to study GVHD and to test new therapeutics, and to study also the graft versus leukemia effect. So in this model, we take immune deficient mice, we inject them with immune cells from a healthy human individual, and then we monitor the mice 3 times a week until endpoint. And this is all done under the umbrella of the UAW Ethics Approval Committee. We can study early GVHD in this model, which normally occurs at weeks 3 to 4. And we can also take these mice to quite late endpoint and also study GVHD. In addition, we then take tissues from these animals, and using various cellular and molecular tools, we can analyze all sorts of things within the laboratory. In addition, in this model, we can treat our mice with various treatments and then study the effects on graft versus host disease. In addition, with this model, we can inject human leukemia cells 2 weeks after we initially transplant human immune cells, and then study leukemia over a period of 3 to 4 weeks. And this also allows us then to study the graft versus leukemia effect. And so if we look a little bit at how graft versus host disease is initiated, as well as the GVL effect, we can see here we've got these cells, which we call host antigen presenting cells. So these are immune cells that kickstart an immune response, and they can recognize or be recognized by the donor T cells. The donor T cells are the main cells that mediate graft versus host disease in people, although other cell types are involved. And so an antigen presenting cell can interact with the donor T cell. This causes the donor T cell to become activated. It then proliferates and expands in number, and then it can mediate the graft versus leukemia effect. And then from this same pool of cells, we can also get the graft versus host disease occurring as well. And so what we've been doing as a research team for over 10 years is using various therapeutics to try and block GVHD. And we've had success showing this using inhibitors of P2X7, the interleukin-6 receptor, and a drug called post-transplant cyclophosphamide. And what we've shown that a number of these treatments can prevent graft versus host disease without compromising the graft versus leukemia effect. And as important as it is to continue these studies, and our group will endeavour to do so, about 2 years ago, we began really asking the question, particularly after discussions with our consumer, Neil Pennock, who's on the panel today, about can we really improve, can we also improve stem cell transplantation just by increasing the donor stem cell pool, especially with young men from Australia. And that's what's given rise to this team that's assembled today. And we hope to continue on in both these areas of research. And so finally, I'd just like to acknowledge everyone that's been involved in this work for the past 10 years, and especially my colleague, Debbie Watson, who's co-led the studies on graft versus host disease and the GVL effect with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron, for explaining that and sharing your research. I guess when we hear the statistics, it can be hard to go back to imagine what it's like for an actual patient and their loved ones and connect with the human experience. And Neil, you've been working hard for years to increase Australia's stem cell donor registrations. And I know this is a painful experience that led you to this mission. Would you please share with the audience how this all happened?
Excuse me just one sec. Okay. Now, my role throughout most of this is to put a human face to stem cell transplantation and graft versus host disease. So TLR
Sorry, Neil, we lost you and you're on mute. Can we try that again?
Yes, sorry, my internet just kicked out. Can you see that?
All good, thank you.
I am so sorry. Technology and me is not the best. Look, TLR is named after Trace. Sorry, it's cut out again. Can you hear me? Oh, you can. Let's try this for the third time. This is Trace. He spent his entire life working in the non-profit industry, raising money for a whole bunch of charities as a fundraiser, as a bequest manager, from Mission Australia to the Children's Hospital at Westmead. He was actually applying for a job in the St. Vincent's Hospital, the St. Vincent's Curran Foundation, when he got that phone call to say he'd been diagnosed with MDS, which Ron mentioned before, a blood disorder which often left untreated turns into leukemia. Now, chemotherapy generally can successfully treat many people, but sadly that wasn't the case with Trace, and he was told that not only did he need a stem cell transplant, but they needed to find a donor. So instead of going to work for St. Vincent's, he ended up being admitted as a patient. Now, even whilst he was on his in his bed going through his transplant, he learned that the nurses and the whole team were trying to raise money for the world's greatest shave. And one anonymous nurse had agreed to shave their heads if they reached their target. And he found out about this the day before. They had only raised something like $700 at that time. So he put his fundraising hat on from his hospital bed and raised $7,000 overnight. So we got to meet that mystery nurse, and it turned out to be one of the nurses who was caring for him. And what those nurses do every single day is nothing short of heroic. It takes a very, very special person to be a nurse working in that field. Now, we've also heard that finding donors, generally you'll go for one of your siblings. Tracy had a bunch of siblings, but none of them were a match. So we had to then go to the Australian bone marrow donor registry, which is connected to the worldwide registries. We've already heard that finding a donor can be incredibly challenging. It's all based upon your tissue type, and you inherit 50% of that from your mom and 50% from your dad. So to be a match, you've got to find someone with the same tissue type or the same ethnic background or mix of ethnic backgrounds. And as we've heard, the closer the match to the donor, to the patient, the less likely the patient will develop a number of complications, but especially graft versus host disease. Now, with Trace, the original donor that was assigned to him pulled out. We don't know why. We never will know why, but they found an option number 2, and the cells arrived. Sadly, those donor cells were not the match everyone had hoped for, and Trace started showing signs of GVHD, and it is a horrible disease. And 42 days later, he took his last breath, surrounded by the nurses, his sister, and me. And I'm never going to stop thinking about what could have happened if that donor had not backed out. So we set up the TLR Foundation in his name. Now, our goals were pretty clear. We started off by raising $300,000 to fund the Trace Ritchie patient room, which is in St. Vincent's Hospital, a state-of-the-art room dedicated for stem cell transplant patients. We established the Trace Ritchie Nursing Scholarship for nurses, basically just to encourage nurses to become specialists in the care they give to transplant patients and any patients being treated for blood cancers by the Trace Ritchie Nursing Scholarship, where nurses are now graduating every year with a Master of Cancer and Hematology Nursing at the University of Sydney. We, of course, support the research that Ron and his team are doing at the University of Wollongong into GVHD. And obviously, our biggest goal is to help find and recruit new stem cell donors. Thankfully, we are one of 4 charities that have recently been picked by the Strength to Give campaign to partner with them to recruit the next generation of stem cell donors, which is incredibly exciting to me. The introduction of cheek swabs is a game changer. The ability to recruit people who are well informed by the use of a simple cheek swab is just incredible. But we do need to make sure that those potential donors know exactly what is expected of them in the donation process so that they can be committed donors, because I've seen what happens when you just back out at the last minute. So we want to make sure that people know exactly what's expected of them. So we're now working with universities to develop a program. We're partnering with student societies for specific events because what we've learned is that we need a captive audience so that we can present and we can explain what the process is and pretty much exclude those people that aren't going to be committed and spend our efforts on those people that are more likely to stay involved and realize that it is an amazing thing to be able to be the only person in the world to save the life of that one person. So please wish us luck.
Thank you very much, Neil, for sharing this experience with us. It's never easy, and your work with Strength to Give and other initiatives is always inspiring. Your determination to improve things, and all of this has helped things come a long way in Australia. We have Kate here from Strength to Give, the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry, to shed light on how we address this challenge of recruiting donors nationally. Kate, could you please tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, can everybody see me and the presentation? Can't see you. Yep. Okay, thank you, Erin. I couldn't see anyone. So my name is Kate. I'm the Head of Marketing and Engagement for the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry. Just change slides. You may also know us as Strength to Give. Strength to Give is the public-facing brand of the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry. We are Australia's only registry of stem cell donors. So about 1,000 people each year look for a stem cell donor. Half of them find a related match, so a match within their family, and the other half come to us to look for an unrelated match. So that's what we do. We facilitate, so we manage, maintain the stem cell registry of donors. We then facilitate the match between a donor and a patient. That patient can, that donor can either come from Australia, from our existing pool of donors, or we facilitate the search within international registries. So our current sources of donors, we recruit Australian donors via cheek swabs. This is only fairly recent. This was introduced in Australia 2 years ago. Prior to that, and still, we work with our biggest recruitment partner, which is Lifeblood, to recruit Australian donors via blood donation. And then finally, as I said, we work with those international registries to access donors from around the world. Now, currently, 80% of our unrelated transplants come from international donors, and Gemma mentioned this before. This is incredible that we have access to this and that we have partners with the registries around the world, but it does come with challenges. Transportation issues, global pandemics when borders close and nobody can travel between countries. That was interesting for our team. But also think about some unrest that we have around the world. Russia and Ukraine war stopped transplants from happening. Recently, over the past couple of weeks, that has what's happened in Israel and Gaza. The Israeli registry has had to stop working. So our reliance on international donors does put us at risk. So how can we improve patient outcomes? What are the success factors and the things that we're working towards? First of all, a large registry of young, healthy, and predominantly male donors. Gemma mentioned this before. Male donors are important because the research is showing and the outcomes are showing that they have a greater efficacy. A registry makeup that reflects the ethnic diversity of our population. We're an incredibly multicultural country, but our registry needs to reflect that as well. And then finally, and really importantly, as we just heard with Neil, donors who are engaged, willing to donate when they are matched, and contactable when they're matched. So how are we currently going against those? We have 144,000 searchable donors currently. This number was as of last week. 15% of those are young men, our ideal donor, young men between 18 and 35, so only 15%. That is only 0.2% of the eligible population. So can we say that we have a large registry of young, healthy, predominantly male donors? No, we don't. We have an ageing registry, we have a small registry, and we also have a registry that is predominantly made up of Northern European heritage. So if we look at our registry makeup, we have shortages of Northeast Asian and South Asian, Middle Eastern, Pacifica, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander donors. That latter in particular, that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are our First Nations people, which means that we can't go anywhere else in the world for those to help those patients. So we have to not just have, it's not just ethical for our First Nations people, we do need to do it because they have no other option. So how are we going in terms of engagement and willingness? 21% of those 144,000 people don't have a valid mobile or email. So if they are matched, our only way of contacting them is through their last updated address. So we have to mail them. Not ideal. And when we get to a point where they are matched and they're asked to go through verification testing, which is the test to determine that they are the right person, they are the right match, 34% currently are not willing or able at that point. Now, there's always going to be some situations where people are not able to donate. You might have a woman who is pregnant or breastfeeding, or they have illnesses. So the WMDA, which is the World Marrow Donor Association, gives us a target of 20%, and we're currently at 34%. So what are the roadblocks? In 2021, we did some consumer research, and here are the key themes. There's a lack of awareness around the need. So there's very, very little awareness of the prevalence of blood cancer and the urgent need for donors. Garth, our COO, says stem cell donation is the cure that no one talks about, and that is very true. There's a lack of awareness about ABMDR and strength to give. Who are we and what do we do? And essentially, why do we do it? There are some very prevalent misconceptions, negative associations with the words bone marrow donation. People fear that it is painful and invasive. And we've obviously come a long way from a medical perspective in the last couple of decades. Only 90% of the transplants that happen in Australia at the moment, only 10% are via the hip, via bone marrow. All the others, 80 and 90% of it happens via what is essentially a long blood donation. So overcoming those perceptions is really important. People think, I've already donated. I've donated blood. I've already donated my stem cells, or they think that donation occurs when they die. Up until recently, we've had very limited methods of registration. So up until 2 years ago, registration as a donor only happened via blood donation. And that restricts a whole lot of people. There are perceptions of cost versus benefit. So think about those misconceptions, and then also add on top that there's time to take off for, if you're a donor, you've got to take off work, studying, home commitments. The balance between the cost of donating and the benefit that has for that patient, people are just not aware of, and they're not seeing that balance. And then maintaining donor engagement and value over long periods of time. If a donor joins when they are 18, they're eligible to donate up until 60. As a marketing challenge, 42 years of engagement is incredible. I can't say I have heard of anybody else that has a challenge of engaging their customers, clients, or donors for 42 years. So increasing our donor pool and size and quality is the purpose of what we're trying to achieve. Now, this is a donor life cycle. Very commonly, if you're coming from the marketing world, this is a customer life cycle. So we have over on the left-hand side, the level of donor engagement, and on the bottom is our time. So we need to recruit people, bring in a greater number of young male donors who are willing, and bring them into the registry. Then, as I said, keep them engaged for up to 42 years. So this is our challenge. What is Strength to Give doing about it? Our recruitment activities. 3 weeks ago, we launched one of the largest national awareness and recruitment campaigns that we have ever done. This is going to run for at least 9 months, and its purpose is to raise awareness of the need for stem cell donors and encourage people to join. We have third-party recruitment partnerships like Neil and the TLR Foundation. They will be out in the community and recruiting from within the community. This is actually really important, particularly for ethnically diverse communities. The research shows that call to action, that the recruitment has to happen and be sponsored within the community. So those third-party recruitment partnerships are really important. Community partnerships with workplaces and national associations to get more young people in. And also storytelling. Storytelling is incredibly powerful to help overcome some of those misconceptions. And then from our engagement activities, really simply, and this is really important for people who come via Lifeblood, a welcome experience. Why are they here and what have they signed up to? Making sure that they're aware of Strength to Give and the importance of them being willing, able, and contactable. Regular storytelling communications, periodic actions. When your mobile number changes, let us know. When you change address, let us know. The research from around the world is showing that the donors are more willing and engaged at that point of verification testing if they just do an action, a simple action of updating their email address or their mobile number or their address, or responding to a commitment survey. All of those very minor little actions over time lead to more willing donors once they're matched with the patient. And finally, when they are matched with the patient, making sure that they have the information that they need and the support they need to go through that donation process. Irish, back to you.
Thank you, Kate, for sharing all this information with us. So I guess that's where I come into the picture, given all the challenges in recruiting ideal stem cell donors, and particularly young males. Our research team is taking a slightly different approach, building on research on blood and stem cell donations. So let me talk a little bit about that. I'll share my screen. So those two research areas, stem cell and blood donation, are kind of related. They both come from blood, but there are a little bit of difference, or a significant difference between what it's like for the donor. So to donate blood for the donor, it's a fairly broad match. Most people will match with someone, whereas as we've heard for stem cells, the match has to be quite specific. The duration of the donation is very different. To donate blood, many people donate blood. It's an hour or two max of commitment. It's flexible. You choose when you go. You can go somewhere close by. There's usually a blood donation collection unit somewhere close by. Sometimes they'll come to you at your workplace or at an event, and the preparation is fairly minimal. But as we've heard, with stem cell donations, the preparation can be quite extensive, and it requires a medical procedure from the donor. It requires a specific match. The duration of the donation itself, so the preparation, including the preparation, can take a few days, and sometimes the donation itself can take more than 1 day if they can't harvest enough stem cells. And the timing is quite rigid. It's not a flexible timing that you can choose when to do it. If you are called upon to donate stem cells, you are needed at a particular time because the recipient is being prepared and being quite vulnerable. And there are only specific clinics that will do that. So it's not, if you live somewhere out west and you're 7 hours away from a major city, that's a bit of a complication. So the point of all of this is to say that all the constraints that are on stem cell donations are much greater than the constraints on blood donation. So whatever we know on recruiting blood donors, it's much more emphasized and much more enhanced for stem cell donors. So let's have a look at what blood donation recruitment research tells us. A recent review of the research on blood donations had a look and said, well, most of the time, the way this was researched, the way people look at the blood donation decision is as a cold decision, a rational decision, an individual decision reliant on theory called theory of planned behavior. And indeed, there's a lot of planning involved in, or some planning involved in donating blood. But what this research review found, it had a look at all different levels of an individual decision. Oops, sorry. an individual decision. And it talks about how an individual has multiple layers, and all of these layers are acknowledged. But what it did find is that three main things were missing when looking at an individual's decision to donate. And those three are affect or emotion, memory, how people remember this experience, and the context. And the thing is that donating blood involves a lot of emotion, and it's not really a cold and rational decision. It's more a social decision or an altruistic decision by nature when people choose to donate for someone else's benefit. And certainly when we talk about a complex donation like stem cell donation. So the approach we're taking is more collective rather than individual, and we're relying on two different theories. One is social learning theory that originated in the 80s, and basically what this theory says is that people learn and adopt behaviors based on observing and imitating others that are in their social environment. So people observe, imitate, and model, and based on modeling of others, the behaviors that they adopt. And there's evidence that shows that social learning helps recruit blood donors among high school students. So that's good and important news for us. The other theory we're looking at is called social identity theory. Social identity theory says, well, our identity, the way we perceive ourselves, is quite complex. And one of its components is the way we perceive ourselves compared to others in our environment. And the way we construct this social identity is we categorize the social environment that we're in. We categorize it in terms of nationality, ethnicity, culture, profession, interests, and various choices. And we categorize the groups that we can see around us, and we constantly compare ourselves to these groups and ask ourselves, where do we fit? Where do we belong? Which groups do we identify with? And we kind of put ourselves within a group as opposed to a group that's an out group. And what's interesting about this theory is that people constantly seek a positive way to distinct themselves from other groups. So if I identify with a particular group, I will constantly try and make myself feel better, that my group is better than the group that I don't identify with. And this social identity is constructed, among other things, through what we call prototypical behaviors. And what that means is they are actions or attitudes or expressions, like, holding a sign or wearing a t-shirt or something, that we adopt to conform or to represent norms or values of expectations that are associated with a particular social group that we want to identify with. So the reason we're looking at all of these theories is to see how can we recruit stem cell donors and at the same time transform the mindset into one of more interest and awareness and the term devotion to contribution. The reason I use this image, by the way, is because this is actually from Lifeblood campaign about donating blood together. And this is essentially what we're going to try to do. But with this project, we're going to do it among young people in a mentoring context. So we're looking to get involved with mentoring programs where we have senior people that support younger people and socialize them into particular behaviors. So we're relying on the positive mentoring relationship that is established through the mentoring program. And that way we want to address some of the issues that Kate discussed. So for example, providing trusted and comprehensive information on how blood and stem cell donations work. And that would help hopefully address misconceptions and raise awareness. In our research, what we plan to do is to have the mentors model and actually donate blood in the presence of their mentees. So create normalization of that activity. And we would like the mentees to observe needles going into someone's arm. So we would raise awareness towards the need, and we would also raise awareness towards how it is done and normalize it, because fear of needles is actually one of the greatest deterrents of blood donations. So we're hoping that by normalizing it, especially with young mentees, we can address that that aspect. And by creating a social identity of I'm somebody who contributes, we would like to support that whole cost benefit that Kate talked about, and support that engagement so that the mentees themselves identify with this group of I am contributing, I am a blood donor, I am a tissue donor. And all of these attempts to engage become easier. And we hope that this will create a positive, addressing this whole positive affect, a positive emotion, because this is done within a social experience that, again, hopefully would be a positive one. There would be a shared positive memory for the group and a safe social context where we actually don't mandate for the mentors to donate blood. We ask them if they would, but if they don't, what we ask for them to do is to discuss the reasons why they don't. We also want them to talk about supporting donations, even if they can't donate themselves. How can you support others? How can you engage others? And this is particularly important from the gender perspective, because we can engage young women or women in general in a desire to donate. But if their donation isn't the one that we're looking for, they can still contribute by help recruiting young men. So this is where we can finish our talk for now. I'll stop sharing and let's have a look and see if we have any questions. So we have a question from Peter Robertson, and it's a question that was raised that we discussed just before. So would people donate only if there is something in it for them? And Peter asks, have we considered possible reward or recognition for donors? And I would like Ian, if possible, to respond to that. Oh, sorry, Ian has to leave. Okay, Gemma, you're it.
Yeah, sorry, Ian's had to leave and go back to clinic. So we spoke about this earlier, and Peter, I'm not sure if you're talking about a monetary compensation, but that's not something that we do in Australia. That's actually illegal to do. But they, I guess the driving force behind the way that we treat it is that there is a sort of moral and ethical component to it, that it is about altruism and a public service to save people's lives. So that's not something, monetary wise, that's not something that we would ever consider. I'm not sure what other kind of recognition would be considered. Okay, I don't know if you ever sort of rewards or recognition is something that you would ever talk about at the registry.
Not rewards. In terms of monetary rewards, as you said, it's against the Health Tissue Act in order to pay for tissues, the Human Tissue Act. Sorry. In terms of recognition, one thing that we have found is that social recognition can be important to people. So when we encourage people to share that they have become a donor, and share that they have just donated to save someone's life, and we find a surprising number of people proactively do that, and that gives them social recognition.
Thank you, Kate. I suppose in terms of probably not reward, but what I would be looking into in terms of governmental support would be not so much a reward, but a cost mitigation. Because if you think about it, a young male donor is likely in this day and age to be a casual worker. And for them to lose 1 or 2 or 3 days of work is a significant donation. And if that could be mitigated, I think that would help as well. But definitely no, I definitely wouldn't support as Gemma and Kate said, I wouldn't support a reward for it because it leads to a whole heap of other problems. We have another question about men who have sex with other men and whether they are eligible to donate stem cells. And I see that Neil has already responded in writing. Neil,
this is an absolute yes, they can if you if you register through the Strength to Give campaign using the cheek swab. There's still exclusions by lifeblood of gay and bisexual men cannot donate blood unless they've been celibate for 6 months, which I find rude and offensive on so many levels. Whereupon the use of cheek swabs, we don't care. All members of the LGBTQ community, I mean, that's about 10% of our population who are currently excluded. We welcome everyone, absolutely, as long as you are healthy and fit within the eligibility criteria to join, which is aged 18 to 35, healthy Australian, permanent residency or citizen, and have a valid Medicare card. We welcome everyone. So great question. I'm really glad you brought that up. We will be holding our first stall at Mardi Gras Fair Day next year if our application is successful. So it'll be the first time in Australian history we will be promoting and actively encouraging members of the LGBTQ+ community to join.
And I would like to highlight that when we say young males, we mean biologically males. So trans males or males who've chosen not to identify as such are still very much needed for stem cell donations. We were wondering if we could probably share a video, a recent video from the ABMDR campaign that is now launching to recruit young people. Kate, would you? Thank you.
Off mute. Yes, I can do that, Eric. No problems. Here's a video we prepared earlier.
Use a proof because my face. There's no one like me. There's no one like me. There's no one like me. Yeah. There's no one like me. There's no one like me. No one like me.
There's no one like me. That's why I need you.
So this is part of our There's No One Like Me campaign that we launched 3 weeks ago to raise awareness of the need for stem cell donation and recruit more young people. Oh, sorry, I've got a slide. So here's our shameless plug. If you would like to become a volunteer stem cell donor, head to this website. QR code sends you right there and a cheek swab will be delivered to your home.
And also remember, if you are above 35, you probably know people that are under 35.
We have a couple of other questions. One saying that if the outcomes of being older are only slightly worse, is it worth extending the target age? Ron, would you be able to speak to that? Or
yeah, I can. I think the main purpose in recruiting younger people is that you'll have them for that couple of decades and that 42 years that Kate was talking about. So if we can invest in younger people, we've got those people for a longer period. And so clearly if someone signed up at 18 and they were a match for someone at the age of 50, yes, we would still use that person to as a stem cell donor. So it really is about just trying to use the limited government resources that we have in the health system to try and create the best pool of donors.
thank you. And we've got a quite a detailed question from Reese. asking what is the plan to increase the registry in terms of what percentage of those who have made at least one donation at Lifeblood also exist on the bone marrow registry. I can answer the second one, but Kate, you probably can answer the first one.
Sorry, Erin, I missed the beginning of the question. Just having read it, what is the plan to increase the registry in terms of percentage who have made one donation? So we work quite extensively with Lifeblood. They are, as I said, our biggest recruitment partner. Funny enough, we're actually meeting them next month to talk about how do we do just that? How do we make sure that the right people are coming through from blood donation, that they are being asked whenever somebody who is eligible and sitting in that that chair giving blood is actually coming through. So while I can't give you the exact answer now, be assured that we're on it and we work very closely with Lifeblood.
Thank you, Kate. I've lost Reese's question. And there's a question there, should screening become a default element of donating?
Sorry, I don't think I understand that question.
I'm not sure either. Reese, do you mean screening when you get registered? I think that is the case. I think people do when they register, they are asked to screen themselves in terms of eligibility criteria, like if they have particular illnesses or other things, if that's what you've meant.
Yes, I mean, the other way of interpreting that question is it just screening for diseases. So that would occur for both blood donations and stem cell donations. But at the moment, they're very separate arms to our healthcare system. So blood collection for blood transfusions is one part, and blood stem cell donation is separate to that, and they work separately. Of course, once you become a cheek swab, that then screens you for your genetic match, and that will go into a database that can then be matched to potential patients into the future. If that answers the question.
I can see that Reese has added, yes, I mean, if you get a donation, should being put on the registry being automatic part of the process. Our challenge with that is that they do need to provide consent, because it is different tests and elements of your biology that we are keeping on file. So they are very, very personal information that we are keeping in the registry. So you do need to consent with that. So unfortunately, it can't be automatic. Otherwise, our job would be much easier.
And thank you, Kate. There's also a question I think Ron could respond to, or Gemma, the effects and downsides post-donation to the donor in terms of daily life or biological functioning.
So in the short term, there's no issue. So you give the donation, there might be a bit of bone pain if you're donating blood stem cells and having GCSF, but within a day or two you've mostly recovered, and that's it. And I don't think there are longer term issues related to donating your stem cells.
And if I could just chime in there, when you're talking about bone pain, we're talking about the type of bone pain or muscle pain that you feel like the day after you've just done a gym workout. I went through this process in 2003, and sure, I was sore for a couple of days, but weighing that up against potentially saving someone's life is a really small price to pay.
Thank you, Neil.
Sorry, I just noticed the other question that Reese asked was about, should being on the registry be mandatory in terms of matching as many people as possible? Neil or Kate, I don't know if you want to talk about the German model of how it works over there.
I'm sorry, I can't talk to that, Gemma, so feel free to take that.
So I don't know if it's still the case, but previously, because they had national conscription in that process, people were automatically signed up. So it was an opt-out process of you're signed up for conscription and you become a donor, a blood and stem cell donor. And so it was, it was more difficult to opt out than to just join the registry.
That's why a lot of donors originate from Germany. There's a culture there where it's accepted that you would just sign up and be a bone marrow donor. And again, the chances of you ever being called up is still, in Australia, it's 1 in 1,500 people are ever going to get a call. I know in America it's 1 in 450 people, and I'm not quite sure what it is in Germany, but lots of Germans donate stem cells and go on to save the lives of people with blood cancer. So it's a good thing.
And my understanding that it's the same in Israel. So the conscription, because there's mandatory military service, they just do it as they go through the drafting process. They just, so they have one of the highest registrations in the world. But culturally, I think it's less acceptable here. So it's definitely something we want to cultivate as a voluntary choice among young people. And that's what this project with the mentoring is directed at cultivating that mindset of, I can contribute and therefore I will. We'll take the last question and then we will finish for today. And thanks very much to everyone for being here. This question is about whether it's possible to have the kits sent discreetly, because some cultures might have issues with tissue donations.
That's a really good question. So the kits are sent in an envelope. Yes, it does have strength to give on it, but we also give the option of that kit can be delivered wherever they request it to be. So if they want it to be delivered at work or at home or somebody else's house, it's really up to them. And I can't say it's an issue that we've had come up, but a really important watch out as we work more toward more with the ethnically diverse communities.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to the panel members for coming to this hour, and many thanks to Jill and UOW Media Unit for organizing it. And thank you all for all of our audience and for your wonderful questions. And if you know any 18 to 30-year-olds, young males that you think would be open to contributing to our country, please bring them on board. Thanks so much, everyone.